Oh,
Good
hey
morning.
George, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Well, actually, I'm a little bit frazzled. This has been one of those days already.
Oh, I've been having one too. Let's compare.
Okay, well, I started somehow. This friend of mine just talked me into helping him with a triathlon this weekend. So I agreed. I didn't want to do the whole thing. I did it last year. I'm just not in shape to do it this year. But he
Well,
talked
you mean
me
you're
into
going to
doing.
like stand on the sidelines and give people cups of Gatorade and things as
Well,
they pass
no,
by?
I'm actually a little bit more arduous than that. This is a kayak, run, and bike triathlon. He talked me into doing the biking part.
Really? So,
And
you're
so,
actually going to? Wow.
yeah, sure. Well, last year I did the whole thing, and man, I was wasted. Well, this is about a 25-mile bike. It's not too arduous. And I thought I'd go out for a little training run this morning, and of course, I got a flat tire.
Oh,
So I ended up having to walk my bike for like a mile, then I had to call Susie to come and get
oh
me.
no.
So
You don't fix your own flats?
no.
No.
That's way beyond my. That's possible, huh?
Apparently.
Okay. See, I'm always learning new things from you, George. So what's going on your end?
Oh, well, I not nearly as romantic as a triathlon. Actually, last night the kitchen sink became plugged up, which it does about once every year. So I poured a couple of bottles of Drano down there and let it set overnight, and I hoped that would do it, and it didn't. So I had to get out the plunger and just a big mess and a horrible way to start your day. But the thing that really, do you know that it's no longer possible to buy Drano crystals?
No, I didn't know that. Is that
These
because
are the little
people
blue
commit
crystals that are, they're basically lye.
Yeah, people commit suicide with it? Or
Well, that's what I thought, that it was because people used it for suicide, and because it's dangerous. Like if you put the lye down there, especially the way I used to do it, then I'd pour boiling water down, which they say in huge red letters that you're never supposed to do, but that always opened the drain. But, there's a danger it would go up back in your face and blind and scar you. But
Yeah.
So that's why I figured every time I go to the store, all they have now is this liquid Drano gel that doesn't work, and you have to pour like a half bottle. I mean, it's great for Drano because they make a lot more money, because an old can of crystals would last, years, and then one of these bottles, just like a 1 or 2 shot thing. But anyway, I got on the web and did a little research, and it turns out that the reason you can't buy Drano crystals is because people use them as one of the ingredients in methamphetamine labs.
Oh, Christ.
Can you imagine that?
Oh, man. I just read something about... Actually, I'm reading this wonderful book by Richard Preston about trees.
Oh yeah,
I'm
I've seen that.
I'm hoping we can get him on someday. And he's talking about Northern California and all these people who climb giant redwoods. And he's got some reference to this town where there are these tree climbers, and there are also all these meth labs.
Oh yeah, up north.
They cut the meth with battery acid. And can you imagine people inject this stuff into their veins?
Battery acid, Drano?
Oh my God. Gives drug users a bad name.
It's horrible. And then in addition to these meth labs being this just horrible social and health burden on the United States, they're causing this national plumbing crisis because you can't get Drano anymore or the real stuff.
It's a coincidence. Just a couple of weeks ago, our drains all backed up, and it turned out we had a major plug in the line going to the septic tank. So we had to have this, these people come here and use one of those long snakes that goes from the septic tank into your house. And I talked to this guy about Drano, and he said, please never use Drano because it's a plumber's nightmare. Not only can it hurt you as the homeowner by exploding back into your face, but he said that when they are messing around in the septic tank or sometimes draining things down in the basement or whatever, that stuff can really hurt them. So they encourage people not to use that stuff at all now.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, so...
Did they use one of those cameras on the little snakes like they use for endoscopies and colonoscopies? Those are amazing.
This guy was kind of low tech. I don't think he had he had a motorized snake, and he said actually the snakes without the motor that you can just get from Home Depot work great.
Oh.
He was urging me to get one, so I didn't have to hire him for. It cost $700 for this guy to
I know.
come and clean out our pipes.
Oh, but these camera things are amazing. Like a few years ago, this happened, and they came out, and then they said, they couldn't get the drain unplugged, and they said, well, I think we better go get the camera. And they bring out this high-tech thing with a little TV screen, and they put it there, and it's kind of like that old movie, is it called Fantastic Voyage, where they're going around inside your blood vessels, except they're going around your sewer drain. You can see where it turns, and then the big surprise for us was that we were supposed to be, we're right in the city, and we were supposed to be connected to the sewer system, and it turns out that we were connected to a septic tank that was completely illegal and out of code and covered with concrete, so it could never even be pumped.
Uh-huh.
So this resulted in about a $10,000 plumbing extravaganza where we had to put in like a big pump, a sewage pump, because it has to pump uphill to get to the sewer line on the street. And
oh my God, what a nightmare!
Yeah, so
infrastructure.
So I don't know. I think Drano is the way to go. Well, that wouldn't have helped in this case. But anyway, so much for the science of plumbing.
I just have to say, Fantastic Voyage had a scene that I can still remember vividly. Raquel Welch was in that. And there was one scene where they stepped out of their little submarine. They're in the veins of this, I think it was a Russian scientist or something. And Raquel Welch, and they got stuck or there was some problem going on, and she went out with this wetsuit on, and she was suddenly attacked by, I guess they were antibodies. And they all sort of clustered all over her wetsuit. And so Ernest Borgnine and these other people dragged her back into the submarine, and there was this scene where they're all ripping the antibodies off her wetsuit. And it was one of the formative sexual experiences of my adolescence. It was an incredibly erotic scene.
Wow, I'm going to watch that again. I saw that at a drive-in movie theater in Albuquerque.
Wow. Drive-in. Yeah. So, just one more thing I have to tell you that's going on here that's sort of bothering me. Susie has this, she's got a gigantic swan that she's been taking care of for the last few days. It's actually got a foot that was bitten half off by a snapping turtle.
Oh, no.
So, and it's got some other problems. She's trying to nurse it back to health. This thing poops. It does these poops that are the size of a large dog. And she's got it in a little pen outside. And Merlin, our dog, he's just always hungry. And he actually has been eating the poop of this swan. And he's been
really sick,
farting like you cannot believe. It's these chemical warfare farts in our house.
Oh, God.
That are just,
horrible.
We've got all the windows open. And it's just one of these.
This is worse than a plumbing backup.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Swans can be pretty disgusting and mean, right?
This swan, Susie set it up for some reason in a little kitty wading pond right outside the door of my office. And every time I come and go past it, the thing kind of half stands up and lunges at me and hisses. It's so mean.
Boy, life on the farm.
Yeah.
Or in the bird sanctuary.
So, what are we supposed to be talking about again?
Oh, well, science. What happened this week? I've written down some things. Well, first I wanted to ask you, you had that guy, is it Sean Mooney?
Chris
Mooney. Sean Mooney's a novelist, I think, or someone I went to school with.
Actually, there's another Chris Mooney who's a novelist, too.
Oh, that's what I'm thinking of then.
In fact, Chris sat in on so he gave a talk 2 days ago, and then yesterday he came and spoke to my class, and one of my students was really proud that he'd done all this research on Chris, and he said, so, you had a teacher who told you weren't a good writer when you were in college, so how did you overcome that advice? And Chris said, That's the other Chris Mooney novelist.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and he wrote, one of his novels has kind of a science-y sort of title. See if
Is that right? The other Chris Mooney?
Yeah, I think, I just remember Sean Mooney, someone my brother went to elementary school with. But isn't Chris Mooney the guy who talks about framing?
Yes, his first book was, first of all, this kid, he really is a kid. He's only 29 years old. I was still in journalism school when I was 29.
Yeah.
Chris already has 2 books that have been published. He's traveled all around the world to talk about them. He's got this framing issue. He came to Stevens 2 days ago to give a talk on his new book, which is called Storm World. It's about the link, such as it is, between global warming and hurricanes.
Yeah.
So this science became, it was really in the media spotlight as a result of Katrina 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Because there had been a couple of papers by this guy, Kerry Emanuel at MIT, that had come out just before Katrina suggesting that global warming, human-induced global warming, should cause an intensification of hurricanes and maybe an increase in their number.
Yeah.
And then there was this kind of backlash. And so Chris's book is about this intensely politicized debate over whether global warming is already causing hurricanes to become more frequent and more intense. And in the course of the book, he also got into this framing issue that he's been talking about for a while, which is how scientists should present their results, particularly when they're very controversial and there's an important economic and political dimension. So
just seems to me that that's just what always goes on in science. You're always posturing and trying to put the right spin on your research to get the publicity that will get you public recognition that maybe will help you renew your grant. So it's really kind of a new word for an old thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, telling people to put more spin on things that they say, it just seems kind of, as you say, we're already doing that.
Well, yeah, and it doesn't have to be on political things. Like I was thinking, when you mentioned that Chris Mooney was coming there, and then I read that story about that Dennis Overby had the version in the Times about some research showing that one of these distant planets circling a star. See, in this case, it was a star like the sun, and it had gone through, this. I guess this explosive cycle that our sun's expected to go through in 5 billion years, and yet the planet survived. And then the way that story was spun by the scientists was kind of funny, and Dennis poked a little fun at that, I think, and the way he did his story.
You've got to personalize it. You've got to say, "Oh boy, this means that the Earth will survive beyond the sun blowing up into a
big deal."
A red giant. Phew.
Not any of us on the Earth, but let me see if I can.
Right. Yeah, that was a classic framing story. Well, just one more thing that I wanted to say about Chris that was a real irony that came up. First of all, his talk was great. He's a wonderful presenter. So I urge anybody out there in Blogging Heads land who's in academia and looking for great speakers to talk about a really interesting, controversial topic to get in touch with Chris. He's very easy to get in touch with. But there is this irony in his book and his presentation because he talks about how journalists need to look beyond the mudslinging and the fighting between scientists and really carefully analyze the science itself and try to stick to the data. And that's what he really does in Stormworld. And it's a fascinating book because he's so even-handed, as opposed to his first book, Republican War on Science, which was just a straightforward, completely one-sided polemic that was just bashing Republicans. Now, the irony comes in that his second book hasn't sold nearly as well
Well,
as Republican
yeah.
War on Science because it is so careful and cautious and has all the caveats about the science and tries to give credit to both sides.
Well,
And
also there's a bigger
biased.
market for political books,
Well, that's true.
especially
except this book
especially if something's perceived as kind of a political attack book. Of course, there's also a lot more competition, so maybe it's a wash. But
that's true.
Yeah.
Except that Storm World could have been highly political. It could have been sort of a follow-up to
yeah,
Republican War on Science because the same people who are doubting human-induced global warming, and some of them are backed by money from the oil companies and so forth, are also supporting some of the scientists who are trying to argue that there's absolutely no link between global warming and more intense hurricanes.
yeah.
But
Have you seen
Chris
Michael
tries to-
Crichton's stuff on that? You know, he has a whole bunch of stuff
Yeah.
on the web. One of his novels, I guess, took the an inverse of the usual conspiracy theory, where the environmentalists are cooking the data to. I guess I haven't read the book, so I shouldn't talk about books I haven't read. But isn't that the idea that they're that they're promoting this agenda to shut down industrialization and
Right.
Yeah,
They're all Luddites.
It sort of sounds
Well,
like a
and also-
Lyndon LaRouche kind of theory, actually.
Right. And Chris points out in Storm World that Bush, and first of all, Crichton was invited to testify before Congress on global warming, I guess, a couple of
he
years
is an
ago.
expert.
He's also been invited to the White House. Bush brought him there to talk about global warming privately,
Wow.
according to Chris Mooney. So,
Wow, Bush may even have read his book.
yeah,
If Bush reads books, it's probably...
that's probably the book he has
Yeah,
read on global
yeah.
warming. I very much doubt that he's read Chris Mooney's book.
Probably
But,
not.
so,
I was just looking at the, speaking of global warming and the sun and all of that, I was just looking again at Dennis's piece, and this was what struck me as far as framing, or what I would call spin. The headline is "Scientists' Good News: Earth may survive sun's demise in 5 billion years." I mean, that's not really spin. That's kind of an ironic twist on the way the scientists themselves are taking this otherwise, interesting, but a story that would probably get lost among everything else published that week in Nature, and then coming up with an angle that they put in the press release, or Nature puts in the press release, and then it goes out, and then, a certain number of science writers can't resist grabbing onto it because it's just, such a fun topic. And what I liked about Dennis's piece is he kind of acknowledges that in the lead, where he says there is new hope that Earth, if not the life on it, might survive an apocalypse 5 billion years from now. So he, gives it a nice little spin in the other direction, kind of, I think, pointing out some of the absurdity of worrying about this.
do they have anywhere in here a line to the effect that this is the ultimate in global warming?
No, that would have been good.
That would have been.
Yeah.
I bet if the New York Post has this story, they would have that line.
Yeah, I saw it on BBC Science News had a version, and they took it more at more straight faced without appreciating the irony. But
Well, so the Earth might survive, or Jupiter might survive, but no life would survive, of course.
yeah, I don't think so. So
Unless by then we've turned into highly heat-resistant titanium robots or something.
Well, yeah, or
is
just
quite
virtual creatures in some quantum computer that pervades the universe. But I don't know. 5 billion years is it's longer than the Earth has existed. So it's
Well, by then, one would hope we would have traveled to other solar systems and maybe even other galaxies.
well, yeah. We can't even get to the stupid moon again. It's just pathetic. Did you see that now Google has gotten into the space race?
Yeah, let's see. It put up. I just clipped that. It
25
put up,
million.
That was yesterday, I guess, in the Times. It put up $25 million the Google Lunar X Prize
Yeah.
for an unmanned spacecraft to go to the moon, soft landing, and then it sends out a rover that can go 550 yards and send high-resolution video, still images, and other data back home.
Yeah, which is great, but, you know, it's the kind of thing we should have been doing in 1965 or something. It's just...
Yeah, this whole trend toward private space exploration is really interesting. I wonder, you know, when it first started happening about, you know, it's been sort of happening over the last decade, I was skeptical about how far it could go, but now you have some of these companies that have such immense reserves of cash that they could actually put together a pretty significant space program.
Yeah, something like Google, it's just a wash. and extra millions. And that also seems to, you know, have this appreciation for research that's not going to pay off in the short run. But so maybe they'll make it, but, you know, then we'll be back where we were when, you know, I mean, at least Neil Armstrong was a person walking on the moon. And then
I just wonder how far this could possibly go, and whether, you know, so you and I both grew up when both science fiction and real science seemed to promise that we would, you know, Star Trek would become real.
Oh, it was so exciting.
Someday.
I mean, at least by now we were supposed to have colonies on Mars.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's just amazing. And then, you know, and then instead we decided to have the Vietnam War, and then recooed with the stupid space shuttle. I mean, what's the figure? The space, like the distance that the space shuttle goes off the surface of the Earth is like the distance between Baltimore and Boston or something. It's just pathetic.
That's such a wonderfully deflating statistic.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in journalism school back in '83, I did a story on the L5 Society. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It was, I think, L5, as I recall, and I'm sure the Blogging Heads people will correct me if I'm wrong. It refers to a spot between the Earth and the Moon where you have geostationary, a stationary orbit. So it's not like whirling around the Earth. It's poised between the gravity between the Moon and the Earth is about equal, so it stays there without having to use a lot of rocket propulsion.
Yeah.
I think that's how it works. And Gerard O'Neill, who's I think he was a physicist at Princeton, was this visionary who designed orbiting space colonies. There were these gigantic cylinders that would rotate to simulate gravity, and they would be lined with, I think the way he envisioned it, that you'd actually bring soil into these things, and there'd be trees and other vegetation, and you'd create a simulacrum of life on Earth, little towns and so forth, maybe even streams and forests, and you'd have these gigantic colonies rotating in space around the Earth, and this would be sort of a stepping stone to colonization of Mars and possibly other planets.
And this would have been a private venture?
Well,
he was just proposing it wherever he could get.
I think he was hoping. So the L5 Society lobbied the federal government for more funds to help make these sorts of things happen. So they saw it as something that would require federal money to get going, and maybe it would become private eventually.
Yeah.
But it was just this really imaginative vision of space travel and colonization, and I thought it was cool. So I wrote a piece for the school wire service that was, you know, overall positive, although, you know, as with Dennis's story, maybe a little tone of irony.
Yeah.
But I thought it was great, and you just, you know, all that stuff has really faded away.
Yeah, it's off the table. Remember Freeman Dyson's? project where he was working with a group of people to make a starship that would be powered by nuclear explosions?
Oh,
there's a couple of good books about that. One is called The Starship and the Canoe, and it cross-cuts between Freeman Dyson as a much younger man working on this project, and then his son George Dyson making birch bark canoes up in Alaska, I think, and it's a wonderful, wonderful book. I think it came out in the late 70s or early 80s.
What a contrast in personalities.
Oh,
George Dyson and Freeman Dyson.
Oh, and the book really plays on that too, and then the super high tech and the back to earth kind of guy, or at least that's where he was then. But it's really a nice book. And then I think John McPhee also.
That's the one I remember. The curve
Deltoid Pumpkin Seed, was that it? Or was that a different one?
Well, there was one. The Curve of Binding Energy, was that?
Yeah, no, that was the one with Ted Taylor and nuclear fusion, and God, those were good books. And those were some of the first books that I read that when I really like when I was in college and graduate school, and I thought, wow, this is really the kind of thing that I hope I can write someday.
John McPhee, yes, a model of great, not just science journalism, but
great prose,
nonfiction in general.
Yeah.
That I remember. Dyson also had he had all these different schemes for space travel. So there was one with space sails, where you would have a spacecraft traveling out toward the perimeter of the solar system using the solar wind. So you'd have some kind of fabric that was huge. I think it would be, like a half a mile wide or something, that would capture the radiation emanating from the sun.
Yeah, like windsurfing kind of. Windsurfing with solar radiation.
Surfing the solar wind.
Wow.
He also had something called the space chicken, and the idea was that you would. He had all these incredibly imaginative schemes.
What was
for
the space
using,
chicken? That was in Ed Regis's book, right? About the Institute
maybe
for
I'm
Advanced
mixing up different scientists here, but I thought the idea was that you could design spacecraft that were actually part mechanical and part biological.
Yeah.
And in this one particular example, it would be a mutant chicken that would have these properties that allowed it to exist in space, and you could send this thing off, sort of equip it with various mechanical contraptions, and send that off to explore space as well.
Dyson is just such an amazing thinker. Still, he... Sometime last year, I reviewed a collection of his essays that had come out, and it was just kind of a chance to reread a lot of these things that he'd written. A lot of them were in the form of book reviews in the New York Review of Books, and just wonderful stuff.
He's in that collection. Did it include the piece that he had about ESP?
I can't remember.
Well, because...
what did he say?
Well, he had a review, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago in the New York Review of Books of a couple of books on parapsychology. Mm-hmm. And I think one book was skeptical and the other one was credulous.
Yeah.
And Dyson was sort of reviewing them in a Dyson-esque way, and at the very end, it became really personal, again in that way that Dyson does so effectively. And he said that his mother was one of the founders, maybe it was his grandmother, I think it was his mother, though, was one of the founders of I think it's called the Psychical Society, which is this venerable old society that supported the study of ESP and other paranormal phenomena in England.
Oh, yeah.
Back in the early 20th century. And Dyson then confesses that he has had psychic experiences himself, and he believes in the paranormal. He believes in ESP and these sorts of things. And thinks that there should be more research on it, and that eventually we will have some kind of scientific explanation for it.
A scientific
How about
explanation
that?
of something that most scientists would say doesn't exist.
Well, see, this is what's so fascinating about Dyson. He loves when he says something like this. I can't be sure how serious he is, because he loves saying things that he knows will irritate other scientists, other mainstream scientists.
Did you see that exchange with him and Richard Dawkins on John Brockman's site, edge.org?
I saw the headline, I think. What was that about?
Oh, I'm not exactly sure. I read it, but I didn't read the earlier exchange. But it started out with Dawkins just excoriating Dyson for something he'd said about evolution involving group selection, which I remember you'd mentioned when you had Dyson out there at Stevens Institute, that he was starting to take seriously the idea of group selection and evolution.
That wasn't Dyson. That's E.O. Wilson. And if Dawkins,
Dawkins
is saying that group selection is beyond the pale, then that means he's saying E.O. Wilson and some other very prominent biologists are beyond the pale.
Well, I don't want to read too much into this since I'm just going by memory. Let me see if I can find
I think,
this on Edge.
I remember after I wrote about the Templeton Foundation, Dyson and Dawkins had a nasty little exchange. Dawkins started faulting Dyson for having accepted the Templeton.
Oh, well, yeah,
prize.
right. I know I know they've had some.
And he said that Dyson should denounce the Templeton Foundation and denounce Christianity, and that he's giving credibility to this awful superstitious nonsense. And so it sounds like maybe this recent exchange is a continuation of that.
Yeah, well, here I found it. I'll just read a little bit of this. So Dyson had made a couple of statements in an earlier exchange, and Dyson was describing evolution as being the competition for survival of non-interbreeding species. And he said, quote, this is Dyson, with rare exceptions, Darwinian evolution requires established species to become extinct so that new species can replace them. And then Dawkins just goes ballistic and says, these two quotations from Dyson constitute a classic schoolboy howler, a catastrophic misunderstanding of Darwinian evolution.
Well, the way... Can you read Dyson's
and then
quote
Dawkins
again?
is going on to say that evolution takes place between individuals and even within, takes place within species, and it involves competition of individuals or even competition of genes. Just the the standard approach. And then let's see, Dyson comes back and says, Dear Richard Dawkins, thank you for the email that you sent to John Brockman saying that I had made a schoolboy howler when I said that Darwinian evolution was a competition between species rather than between individuals. You also said I obviously had not read The Selfish Gene. In fact, I did read your book and disagreed with it for the following reasons. And then, it's too long to read, but I urge people who are interested in this discussion to go to edge.org and take a look at this, because it's...
That's an important issue. It's something that Dawkins and some other hardcore selfish gene Darwinians thought that they put to rest decades ago. Mm-hmm. There was this analysis by a guy named George Williams, among others, I think in the 1960s, that showed that group selection just doesn't work, especially in the context of trying to explain the emergence of altruism.
Yeah.
But it's come back. Steve Gould and Dawkins crossed swords over group selection before Gould died many times. As I said, E.O. Wilson is not exactly a heretic. He's the person who really was responsible for popularizing sociobiology in the 1970s and for popularizing selfish gene theory. And so if he's saying that group selection might be real, I think you have to take it seriously. I doubt if Dawkins could accuse E.O. Wilson of, a schoolyard...
Schoolboy howler. Yeah.
Schoolboy howler. That's so Dawkins-esque.
Yeah.
Oh, man, is he good at invective.
Actually, Dyson has a pretty pithy response here. I mean, he has a long response, but within it there's this pithy little nut of a response where he says, it is absurd to think that group selection is less important than individual selection. Consider, for example, dodo A and dodo B, the dodo bird, competing for mates and progeny in the dodo population on Mauritius. Dodo A competes much better and has greater fitness as measured by individual selection. Dodo A mates more often and has many more grandchildren than Dodo B. 100 years later, the species is extinct and the fitness of A and B are both reduced to zero.
Uh-huh.
Interesting.
Well, see, he's obviously given this some thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Whether you disagree with him, you don't just blow off someone like Freeman Dyson for making schoolboy howlers. I mean, he's obviously, if he's making a contentious statement, it's something he's thought about.
Except that you do have to keep in mind with Dawson that he loves to be the contrarian.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether sometimes it's for his own sake, because he likes to he sort of identify scientific dogma and poke it with a stick.
Yeah.
So he also had a recent essay on Edge. I don't know if you noticed this, on global warming, where he talks about how he's been involved since, I think, the early 80s or late 70s. This is part of his work with Jason, this semi-secret government think tank.
Oh, yeah.
Studying, he was one of the first people to start studying numerical climate models, computer models of climate change. And so, he's really been steeped in the history of this stuff. And in this essay on Edge, just within the last month or two, he said that he just doesn't believe the climate models now that are predicting significant global warming as a result of carbon emissions.
I'll have to read that.
So there he is again, sort of pissing off the mainstream scientists.
Yeah. I forgot that Dyson was a Jason.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we should say a little bit about... Did you see that book that Anne Finkbeiner...
I reviewed it for the New York Times.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I just got a copy here, and I just started reading it. It looks terrific.
It's really interesting and disturbing. In my review, some of the people who are in Jason are the most brilliant scientists, mostly physicists.
Yeah, well, Murray Gell-Mann was a Jason.
Murray Gell-Mann was, Freeman Dyson, Steve Weinberger, Murph Goldberger, who I think was president of Caltech.
Murph was, I think he practically started it, and his wife Mildred is credited with coming up with the name, if I recall correctly.
John Wheeler helped to get it off the ground, although I'm not sure if he was a member afterwards. But there was, so these are people that I've met most of them. I've interviewed them and profiled them for Scientific American, and some of them I just admire, not only as these brilliant scientists, but also as activists. Steve Weinberg, for example, is somebody who's really written very thoughtfully about arms control, strategic defense initiative, and all this sort of stuff. So one of the things that was disturbing about Finkbeiner's book on the history of Jason was what they had done in the Vietnam War.
Right, that was the big controversy, wasn't it?
Dick Garwin. Also, who has been at IBM almost forever. Another person who was a really tough critic of Star Wars in the early 80s under the Reagan administration. So I've always thought of these guys as doves.
Yeah.
At least Weinberg and Garwin.
Because thought of them as what?
As doves, as people who were sort of critical of military technology. But during the Vietnam War, I think it's Weinberg and Gell-Mann and Dyson, they did two different things. First of all, they designed this electronic barrier to prevent North Vietnamese soldiers from infiltrating to South Vietnam, that involved dropping these miniature mines all over the place. So these would be they would carpet the jungle floor. They'd be dropped by the thousands out of planes. Mm-hmm. Little mines that would be just big enough to blow off somebody's foot or leg, not necessarily kill them, but they were also designed to make a loud explosion that would be detected by these microphones, tiny microphones that had also been dropped in the forest canopy. The microphones would pick up the noise of the explosion and signal a computer that would then analyze the noises and try to figure out if it was caused by enemy troop movements or maybe by animals or peasants, and then call in an airstrike.
Yeah.
And this is, the idea that Steve Weinberg and Freeman Dyson are working on something like this, I found really disturbing.
I'll have to go back and reread your review.
Yeah. So I thought that the book was a perfect example of showing how, and almost all these scientists regret having been involved in this. Steve Weinberg resigned from Jason for a while shortly after this episode. They also did a study of the feasibility of using nuclear weapons against North Vietnam.
Yeah.
And they said it was a bad idea, but the reasons were very, it wasn't like they rejected it completely just on moral grounds. The reasons were very strategic. They actually said that the U.S. Military would be more vulnerable to a nuclear counterstrike than North Vietnam would be to an initial nuclear strike by the U.S. So the way they analyzed it was very cold and disturbing when it's sort of read in the light of day.
Yeah.
So,
I talked with Murray a bit about the Jasons, and then toward the end when I was writing Strange Beauty, my biography of Gelman, I was going through all of his old papers, and there was a big file on the Jason stuff that I, spent a day or so going through. Although, it was mostly just, kind of bookkeeping stuff about meetings and topics and things. It wasn't anything particularly earth-shaking, but.
Well, I'm surprised. I would think that it was always sort of in a shadowy area as to whether it was. They worked on a lot of classified stuff, but it wasn't clear whether Jason itself was a classified entity. There are some people who never spoke to Finkbein, or others spoke to her only off the record.
Right. Yeah.
But it's a fascinating group. I thought the point I tried to make in my review was that scientists, it's sort of an obvious one, but I think it's important to remind people of, especially when science is as politicized as it is right now under the Bush administration, that even the most admirable scientists can be morally fallible and can make mistakes that they, one would hope, regret later. By the way, in this review, just to show that I'm as fallible at least as anybody, I also admitted that I had taken money from this government contractor working for the CIA to come up with ideas for fighting terrorism. And
well, they must really be hard up if they're sorry.
No, you're right. You're right, George. Absolutely, they must be hard up if they're talking to somebody like me about how to fight terrorism.
Wow.
I mean, that was my thought.
Was it pretty good? Was it pretty good money?
It was pretty good money, and that's why, this is before I had a job, and I thought, first of all, I was kind of flattered. I thought it would be kind of cool, and the money was pretty good. So for all those reasons, I thought,
well, yeah, I applied to be a CIA agent.
You're kidding me.
No,
really?
no, it was after, let's see, when was this? I had been in journalism for a while, and I'd left the newspaper in Minneapolis because I was writing my first 2 books. And then I was kind of at loose ends after the second book and was, sending around queries and things and just deciding what I wanted to do. And I was living back in Minneapolis, and I saw an ad, saying that they were accepting applications for CIA agents. So I thought, well, what the hell? Sent in the application, and then I got a call one day from someone. He asked me to meet him at a hotel somewhere in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area for an interview. So I went there, and we talked for a while, and he said, I would suspect just from talking to you for a few minutes, that you're someone that people tend to underestimate. And, this might be a really good thing for, you seem kind of unassuming and unthreatening and just kind of sitting back and absorbing information. And this might be a good thing for the CIA. And also, the fact that you're a writer is really, that can be good too, because. And then they explained that they were looking for 2 kinds of agents, and one was were CIA agents that would be acknowledged agents that would be attached to a foreign embassy somewhere, and the second group would be agents who were unacknowledged. So he said, for example, you could, we might send you somewhere in the Middle East, and you would pose as someone who was writing a book, and then while you interviewed people, you would identify people who might turn into likely sources for the CIA, and then try to persuade them to, come over to the good side. And I said, oh yeah, that sounds interesting, and we talked about it a while. And then he said the one disadvantage that might get in the way of your being accepted as a CIA agent is that, while they do like to embed writers because they have a natural cover for why they're out there asking questions, that the downside is they might write a book later exposing all this stuff, so we'd have to make sure you weren't one of those kind of guys. And then he said at the end of the interview, he said, well, now the way this works is, you just go away now, and we won't have any further contact with you unless you initiate it. If you decide this is something you want to go to the next step, call this number, and then we'll, it says this will be something that, goes on for, I don't know, months, maybe before, we go through all the hoops, or you can just, walk away. And then they said, I would also urge you, just in case you are interested in this, when you leave, just don't tell anybody about it. Don't tell your girlfriend or any of your friends, and just, just kind of practice what it's like to know something and then not tell anybody and keep secrets.
Oh my God, that's an amazing story.
Well, then I just walked away. I didn't. Well, then actually, what happened was I got a job at the New York Times. So, so I decided, I'd rather work at the New York Times than be a CIA agent.
Oh, I bet there are plenty of people over the years who were working for both the New York Times and the CIA.
Not that I know of, but
that's really interesting, George. This guy sounds really smart. I wonder if I would assume that, first of all, it's such an interesting thing for him to say to you that, I bet people underestimate you. I wonder if he must have been also testing your reactions constantly.
Oh, yeah. No, I just got the feeling. I was, man, this guy was, he was just 100% there, just he kind of inhabited the space, and you knew that everything he said was calculated, and he was taking everything in, and he was obviously highly, highly intelligent.
It sounds almost cinematic. Was this during the Reagan administration?
Well, let me think. It was 1986, it would have been.
Yeah, so it was Reagan administration. I think Bill Casey was still running things back. That was the cowboy era of the CIA. Boy, that would have been amazing.
Sometimes I regret,
That would have been an amazing adventure. But, God, George, you would have been totally going to the dark side.
Yeah, but, maybe, I don't know if I would have done it or not. But, I didn't take the next step. But as I recall, the main reason I didn't was because I just happened to, around the same time, I went out to New York and was visiting my friend Katie Roberts, who's an editor at the Times, who I had worked with at Minneapolis, and I was staying at her apartment, and then she mentioned that they had this opening at the Times, at the Sunday Week in Review, for somebody who would be like a science writer / editor, and I said, oh, I'll do that, and so I ended up, they gave me a tryout, and then eventually I got the job after going through all the hoops. But if I hadn't, I don't know, maybe I would have had a satisfying, exotic career in the CIA.
Well, or maybe you would have ended up indicted and taken the fall for Oliver North or some of those other people.
Yeah, one thing he told me was that if I was one of these embedded writer, secret CIA agents, then if I were captured by a foreign government, said, of course we would do everything we could to free you, but it would all be behind the scenes because we couldn't acknowledge that you were working for us.
Jesus, he was really being candid.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised that you got that
like
far. And I was actually right on the cusp of being too old to be a CIA agent.
Yeah,
I was in my 30s.
God, that is. I've known you all this time, and you've never shared that story. I hope this doesn't mean that the CIA is going to come after you.
Well, he told me that not to tell anybody, just kind of as practice. Not because anything that he said was particularly unknown or controversial, I guess. But now, so I've kept that secret all these years and only told it now on Logging Heads TV.
Yeah,
not
it
really.
Seems like the CIA
it's a great
is
story for I'm sure I've gotten you told that story at a number of dinner parties.
Yeah, that is so interesting. I have one other friend. I can't mention his name, but he spent, I think, 1.5 years, 2 years at the CIA before he went into science journalism, and I met him back in the early 80s. But he described it as kind of boring. Yeah. He was an engineer. He was supposed to design electronic devices, communication devices, I guess, sort of James Bond things. But he didn't really think, it wasn't really that much fun for him.
Yeah,
but he's
some of the analysts' positions might be interesting, but I'm sure a lot of them are deadly dull.
It would just be so weird to be doing serious intellectual work that you could never tell people
I know,
about.
Yeah.
And let alone...
I think it would go against my basic instincts. I like to find things out and write about them and tell them to people and, have an audience of people who read my work, and that would have been... it wouldn't have worked. Yeah.
There's a great book by the writer Norman Rush. I think I've mentioned him in previous Blogging Heads.
He's the South African?
A friend of a friend. He's American, but he spent a lot of time in Africa, I think, with the Peace Corps. And his first book, I think, was called, I've got it here somewhere, was Mating.
Yeah, Mating, and then there was one called Whites.
Something like that. So the first one won a National Book Award. The second one was about a CIA agent who is, I think, also a writer, or maybe not a writer. But he's got some cover in Africa, and and it did a brilliant job in talking about how how he had these two lives, this whole secret life that he couldn't even share with his wife, and he's tracking this subversive African leader whom his wife eventually has an affair with. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. But,
what's it called?
I can't remember.
Okay.
It's just Norman Rush has only had 2
Yeah,
novels.
I'll find it. I have one of his novels on my shelf, and I just haven't read it. That's good. I'm looking for a novel to read.
Man, I never know where these conversations are going to go, George.
I know. I was just I just glanced at the side of my desk and saw this book, which I'll hold up, which is the Alex Studies, about Alex the Parrot. And
Alex.
We wanted to talk about, I'd met Irene Pepperberg, or to back up a little, this story's been all over the paper. I guess the most emailed New York Times story for a couple of days, that Alex, this highly intelligent parrot, and the subject of 30 years of research by Irene Pepperberg at Brandeis university unexpectedly died last week, and I just had met Irene for the first time when I was at that consciousness conference in Las Vegas that I wrote about for the Times, and it's just such a sad thing.
Yeah, and boy, that story was. You see how they ended it?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
so the last
let me find
thing,
that is really, it was really moving.
It was moving. It was almost. I can see. My problem is, as I've mentioned before, we have an African gray,
right?
And his name is Mario, and I hate him. He's a pain in the ass. He once. I forget if I mentioned this. I was playing hockey, and my nostril was ripped off by someone's stick, and it had to be stitched back onto my nose. I was playing over at West Point, so there was this great Army surgeon, and he did a good job.
God, when did this happen?
Pardon me?
When did this happen? That's horrible.
This must have been 10 years ago.
Oh, man.
And like 8 years ago. And then, so I had all these stitches here, and my whole nose was all inflamed and red. And and Susie had just gotten Mario. He was a rescue bird. And I was in the kitchen, and I dropped something, and I thought Mario and I were still getting along then. And I bent down to pick it up, and he was on the back of his chair, and I looked up at him and said, "Oh, hello, Mario," and I sort of put my face near him, and he reached out and bit me right on my stitches.
Oh. Well, I could see how that might skew your opinion of African gray parrots. That's terrible.
I've never forgiven him.
Well, yeah, Alex sounded like a much higher evolved creature.
Well, the one thing that I really noticed with this is that Alex was only 31 years old when he died. Because some of these, I thought these parrots, they can live to be, African grays can live to be 60 or 70.
That's what I read, that he basically died in middle age, completely unexpectedly. And I exchanged some emails with Irene this week because I'm writing a piece about Alex for Sunday's Week in Review.
Oh, really?
In the Times, yeah, kind of an essay, just kind of using this sad occasion as a reason to write about animal consciousness, and so I went through and then that's why I got this book. I quickly I ordered it overnight from Amazon and reread a lot of her stuff and saw there's just some great videos on the web of Alex and just doing these just amazing feats. In fact, there's a pretty good thing on edge.org where there's an interview with her where she describes some of the amazing things. The most amazing one to me was when he seems to have spelled the word nut, N-U-T, as he was demanding food. But I won't talk any more about that because it's going to be in my piece on Sunday. But I just wanted to read the last two, just the very ending that you referred to earlier of Benedict Carey's obituary in some ways of Alex. It says, even up through last week, Alex was working with Dr. Pepperberg on compound words and hard-to-pronounce words. As she put him into his cage for the night last Thursday, she recalled, Alex looked at her and said, "You be good. See you tomorrow. I love you." He was found dead in his cage the next morning, Dr. Pepperberg said.
Oh.
Sad.
Yeah, if I didn't...
No, I mean, she's just devastated. Imagine having a 30-year relationship, for one thing, with this intelligent animal. But then in addition, just you think of the practical, just the impact that was going to have on her research, since this was, the most successful of the, I guess she has a couple of other parrots that she's had some very, made great strides with, but nothing like Alex. So it's really probably going to mean a lot of recasting of the research program. But boy, she's really taking it with, at least publicly, with great aplomb. I read there was a nice NPR piece when she was interviewed, and just very brave.
Well, I'm still hoping that maybe what this tells me is that maybe I'll outlive Mario after all. But there is this whole fascinating history to animal language.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll link to Wikipedia has a great entry on animal language. I've written a little bit about it, in the past.
Yeah.
So Noam Chomsky once. So there have been people who've studied, and before Irene Pepperberg, people who've worked with apes.
Oh, sure, Washoe and
yeah. And Noam Chomsky was always extremely disparaging about claims that these animals had anything resembling language. He once told me that saying that these animals have language because they can learn a few words and communicate in these crude ways is like saying that humans can fly because we can jump up in the air a couple of feet. And there was this guy named Herbert Terrace.
Terrace, right? Yeah. I've interviewed these. I did this stuff too. Back when who was it? The bonobos down in Georgia. Sue Rumbaugh. Yeah. Sue Savage Rumbaugh and her bonobos.
They were the ones who were claiming that this is something resembling language. There was this guy, Herbert Terrace.
Yeah, he debunked it.
Who was sort of a Chomskyan skeptic, and he actually had a chimp who he trained to communicate somewhat named Nim Chimpsky.
Oh, Nim Chimpsky, that's right. Nim Chimpsky. And I think Terrace started out being a believer.
Yeah.
And then actually wrote, saying that he was getting true linguistic behavior in Nim Chimpsky, and then I think had second thoughts, which made it that much more powerful.
Yeah, I remember when I did a profile of Chomsky, and I described Terrace. I had gotten a paper, I guess, that Terrace had done when he was still in the believing in animal language stage, and I referred to him as a believer and mentioned Nim Chimpsky, and he wrote me this letter where he was incredibly pissed off, and he said, I am exactly the opposite of what you've
so you caught him right during the transition, it sounds like.
Yeah, this was like in 88 or 89, I think, and so he really ripped me a new one.
Yeah.
That area is incredibly contentious. Then you've also got dolphins.
Yeah.
You have the crazy old scientist John Lilly, who took LSD and went into tanks and thought he was communicating with dolphins.
Yeah, I think we did a whole conversation on animal intelligence.
Yeah.
Didn't we? Yeah, sort of.
Yeah.
Sort of having deja vu here.
Well, I can't wait to read your piece on Alex and Irene Pepperberg.
It was nice to go back and it gives you a reason to think about this stuff. And I mean, sometimes I'm convinced that with our cats that you could program their little brains with about 200 lines of code. And then other times, you'll just look into their eyes and you really feel like there's some kind of self in there.
Yeah. Well, some people, I think, you feel like you could program with 200 lines of code too, right?
Yeah.
Well, you're also going to have Christine Kennelly. Is that how you pronounce
Christine
her name?
Keneally. Yeah, she wrote this book on language that's been getting a lot of really good press. So. Yeah, I could. Yeah, she said she'd be happy to do a blogging head. So I don't know, when exactly. But are you away next week?
Oh, I don't know. We can talk.
Yeah.
But I read an article about her book that made it sound really interesting. I've got to read Steve Pinker's new book on language.
Oh yeah, I got a review copy of that, and it looks good.
I just read a rave review.
Yeah.
He's coming to Stevens in a few months to give a talk about his new book.
Man, you're really on the circuit there. That's great.
Yeah, it's fun. I just get to invite these people that I want to hang out with anyway to my school. So it's one of the perks of having this academic job.
Yeah, it's great.
So hey,
guess we've done it again.
4 minutes. Covered the gamut from the CIA to talking birds.
Yeah, that sounds. I guess the only thing we didn't get to was the great shrinking kilogram, which we can do that another time.
Yeah, because I'm sure it'll still be shrinking.
It'll be shrinking a week or so from now. So yeah, let's save that. I have some thoughts about what may be going on there.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. So,
Okay, John. Well,
all
good
right, I'll
luck
talk
on
to
the
you soon.
triathlon. I'm impressed.
Yeah.
I
Thanks,
might
and
go
good luck.
hiking this weekend, something a lot more low-key.
Oh, God, believe me, I'd rather do that.
Yeah.
Well, good luck with your weekend review story. And
Okay.
I'll talk to you soon.
Thank